I'm Megan Evans. I'm 35 years old, and at our last Thanksgiving dinner, my own sister, the family's golden child, mocked me for not being in real tech moments before my grandpa revealed that my company had just bought hers for $45 million. Before I tell you how the deafening silence in that room changed our family forever, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I always love to see how far these stories travel. All right, let's get into it. You really need the full picture to understand the weight of that moment. Picture this: Thanksgiving at my Grandpa Edward's house in Denver. This was a classic Colorado scene, a hint of snow in the air, the Rocky Mountains just visible as jagged silhouettes against the bruised purple twilight. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and my mom's famous pumpkin pie. It's the kind of comforting Rockwellian scene that's supposed to feel like home. But for me, for as long as I can remember, it's always felt more like a stage. A beautifully decorated stage where I was a permanent, unpaid background actor in the long-running, critically acclaimed production of The Glorious Life of Gabrielle Walsh. My sister Gabrielle, 4 years my senior, was the star, producer, and director of this show. She was the one who could do no wrong. She was the tech prodigy, the one who'd gotten into Stanford on a full ride, the one whose name my parents, Richard and Margaret, would weave into every single conversation with a casual but oh-so-practiced pride that always seemed to suck the air out of the room for me. And me? I was just Megan, the quiet one, the one who worked in business, a vague, unimpressive, and slightly dirty word in a family that worshipped at the altar of engineering and elegant code. That night, the performance was in full swing, and Gabrielle was delivering a masterclass. She stood in the center of the living room, a glass of expensive Cabernet swirling in her hand, holding court. She was recounting the story of the recent acquisition of her San Francisco startup, Bitewave Labs. To hear her tell it, you'd think she was a chess grandmaster who had just checkmated the world. It's all about knowing your value and having the foresight to exit at the peak, she said, gesturing expansively with her glass, narrowly avoiding splashing my Aunt Carol. Northbridge Systems is a solid, if a bit traditional company. They needed our innovation. They needed our vision. We didn't get bought. We chose our next chapter. It was the perfect strategic move. My dad, Richard, was beaming, nodding so vigorously I thought his head might come loose. "That's my girl," he said. "Always 10 steps ahead of everyone else." I had just walked in the door with my best friend Michael, having come straight from a marathon session at the office. I was trying to slip by unnoticed, head for the drinks table, and brace myself for the evening. But Gabrielle's eyes, sharp and predatory, landed on me. A slow, condescending smile spread across her face. Here she is now, my little sister Megan. She turned to the small crowd of relatives, raising her voice just enough to make sure everyone heard. The only one in the family who understands PowerPoint but still thinks AI is American Idol. A few polite, deeply uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the room. My face burned, a familiar heat creeping up my neck. It was the same script, different year. The same casual dismissal, the same flick of the wrist that brushed my entire career, my entire life, into a pile of irrelevant dust. I just stood there, my hands jammed in my pockets, my jaw tight, ready to endure it like I always did. But then the entire rhythm of the play, a rhythm that had been set for 35 years, stuttered and broke. My Grandpa Edward, who had been sitting quietly in his worn leather armchair by the fire, slowly and deliberately sat down his book. He was 80, a retired math professor with a mind still as sharp as a diamond cutter. He looked at Gabrielle over the top of his spectacles, his expression unreadable. "That's an interesting take, Gabrielle," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a strange weight that cut through the chatter. "You make it sound as if you held all the cards." Gabrielle laughed, a sound that was just a little too loud, a little too brittle. "Well, Grandpa, in this case, I did. It's called negotiation. You have to project strength." Grandpa's gaze didn't waver. His eyes, full of a quiet, analytical power, shifted from her to me. He pinned me with a look, and then he posed the question that would ignite the entire forest. "Megan," he said, and every head in the room swiveled in my direction. "You work in that world. Is it true that a company on the brink of failure can choose its buyer for a $45 million price tag?" The room didn't just go silent. The silence became a physical presence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered every other sound. Gabrielle's smile froze, then melted into a confused, angry scowl. My father's proud expression faltered, replaced by bewilderment. Every single eye in that room swung from Grandpa to Gabrielle and then landed squarely, heavily on me. They were waiting. For 35 years, I had been the one waiting for a crumb of acknowledgement, a sliver of respect, a moment of being seen. Now, for the very first time in my life, they were all waiting on me. My throat was tight, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't just a question. It was a door that had just been kicked open in front of me, and I had to decide whether to finally walk through it. Before we get back to that silent, suffocating living room, I need to take you back a few months. Because what happened at Thanksgiving wasn't a sudden earthquake. It was the final, inevitable collapse of a structure that had been rotting from the inside for decades. To understand the collapse, you have to see the rot. My world is numbers, strategy, and seeing the patterns other people miss. I'm a director of strategic acquisitions at Northbridge Systems. It's a mouthful, I know. My best friend Michael calls me a corporate fortune teller, which is more accurate. I lead a team of 12 brilliant, sleep-deprived analysts, and we spend our days digging through the financial guts of other companies. We hunt for hidden value, for untapped potential, for smaller tech firms that would make our parent company, Northbridge, stronger. We figure out what they're worth, and then we devise a strategy to buy them. I'm good at it. I live for the complexity, the thrill of the hunt. In the 18 months prior, I'd personally overseen 6 major deals totaling over $400 million. I had a reputation for being meticulous, quiet, and relentless. One crisp Tuesday morning in September, I was in my office on the 24th floor of our downtown Denver building. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue. I was sipping my second coffee of the day when my screen lit up with an email from our internal analysis division, a team we called the Vultures because they were so good at spotting weakness. The subject line was bland, clinical. Project Wavecrest, potential Q4 target analysis. I clicked it open. The report was a 30-page deep dive into a mid-sized tech company out of San Francisco. They were a supposed leader in machine vision technology, but according to our models, they were burning through their investment capital at a terrifying rate. Our analysts, with what I knew was cold, hard certainty, predicted they had less than 120 days of runway left. After that, it was either a fire sale or bankruptcy protection. The company's name was Bitewave Labs, my sister's company. I leaned back in my chair, the expensive leather creaking in the otherwise silent office. A cold knot formed in my stomach, tight and painful. It felt like 2 tectonic plates of my life, the professional world where I was respected and competent, and the personal world where I was an afterthought, were grinding against each other with enough force to tear me apart. For years, I had built a firewall between them. It was a necessary act of self-preservation. My phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Michael Chun. He sat 3 desks away from me and was the only person on the planet who knew the full, unedited, director's cut version of the Walsh family dynamic. He was my sanity check, my ally. "You see the Wavecrest report yet?" he wrote. I took a shaky breath and typed back. "Just opened it. This is surreal." A moment later, he replied, "Dude, it's not surreal. It's poetic justice served ice cold. I wished I could see it that way. I wanted to feel that sense of righteous satisfaction, but all I felt was a familiar hollow ache." The report talked about Bitwave's visionary CEO, Gabrielle Walsh, who had perhaps been too focused on innovation to mind the balance sheet. Visionary, that's what they always called her. Suddenly, I wasn't in my high-rise office anymore. The crisp PDF on my screen blurred, and I was 8 years old again, standing in the oil-stained, cluttered garage of our childhood home. My dad, Richard, a software engineer with a rigid, logical mind, was holding up a computer motherboard like it was the Shroud of Turin. My sister Gabrielle, then 12, had just successfully assembled her first PC from a kit she'd gotten for her birthday. It was a big deal. "Look at this, Margaret," my dad had boomed to my mom, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "This is natural talent, an intuitive grasp of systems, a real engineer's mind right here." He beamed at Gabrielle, who soaked in the praise like a desert flower after a rainstorm. He hadn't even noticed the stack of carefully drawn graph papers on my little workbench just a few feet away. It was a business simulation game I had designed myself. It had complex rules for supply chains, marketing spend, demand curves, and even a mechanism for stock market crashes. I had spent a solid month on it, painstakingly working out the math. It was my proudest achievement, a world I had built from nothing but my own imagination. But in the bright, impressive glow of Gabrielle's humming computer screen, my little paper world, my world of strategy and value, was completely invisible. It was never overt cruelty. You couldn't point to a single moment and say, that was abuse. It was something more insidious. It was a quiet, constant, soul-crushing indifference to my world, and a loud, unending celebration of hers. At my high school graduation, my father was asked to give a toast. He stood up, raised his glass, and spoke for 5 full minutes about Gabrielle, who was already a sophomore at Stanford, and her brilliant future. He completely, utterly forgot to mention that I, the actual graduate, had just won a full academic scholarship to the University of Michigan's prestigious business school. It wasn't until my grandpa, God bless him, cleared his throat loudly and said from his seat, "And let's not forget Megan's remarkable achievement today," that my dad flustered, mumbled, "Oh, right, that too. Good job, sweetie." That too. 2 words that summed up my entire existence in that family. I was an addendum, a footnote in the grand story of Gabrielle. The most painful memory, the one that still had the power to make my stomach clench, resurfaced as I stared at her name on the screen. It was 5 years ago, at a 4th of July barbecue. I had just landed a highly competitive internship at a top-tier venture capital firm in Chicago. I was ecstatic, proud. I thought, maybe this time they'll see. This was a world of high-stakes finance and technology. It bridged their world and mine. I told them the news, while my dad was flipping burgers. My mom just nodded, a polite, vacant smile on her face before turning back to Gabrielle. "So, Gabby, tell us more about this new blockchain project you're consulting on." Later, Gabrielle cornered me by the drinks cooler, a smirk playing on her lips. "Venture capital," she'd said, her voice laced with a unique blend of pity and contempt. "Isn't that just like marketing for the companies that do the real work? You write slogans and make spreadsheets for things you don't actually understand, right?" The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were clever, but because they perfectly articulated my deepest, most secret fear. That they were right, that I was a fraud, a parasite on the world of real tech, the world where she was a reigning queen. That was the day Grandpa Edward pulled me aside. We walked to the end of the driveway, away from the cheerful chatter and the smell of gunpowder from the neighborhood fireworks. He put a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. His eyes, full of a wisdom I was only just beginning to understand, met mine. "Your father sees the world in black and white, in ones and zeros," he said, his voice low and serious. "He understands building a thing. He doesn't understand building value. They are not the same skill. Don't ever let him convince you that one is less than the other." He paused, looking back at the brightly lit house. "You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to be heard. You just have to be the most prepared. And when the time comes, you must stand up, not to show off, but to claim the space that has always rightfully been yours." His words became my North Star. I stopped trying to win their approval. I stopped sending them links to articles about my promotions or the major deals I'd closed. It was pointless. I just put my head down and worked. I built my own world, my own value, in the quiet, focused silence they had created for me. And now, after all these years, my world had just aimed a torpedo at hers. Back in my office, Michael came over and leaned against my doorframe, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me. "So, what are you going to do?" "I have no idea," I said, rubbing my temples. "This is a minefield." "You have to recuse yourself, obviously," Michael said. "It's a massive conflict of interest." Of course it was. The first rule of our business: you couldn't be involved in a deal where you had a personal connection. Could land you in serious legal trouble. My direct boss, Monica Reeves, was a sharp, no-nonsense executive vice president who valued results above all else. She had championed me, promoting me to director when I was just 32, years ahead of my peers. She trusted my instincts implicitly. I knew I had to tell her immediately. I walked the long, quiet hallway to her corner office. The glass walls looked out over the entire city. The door was open. "Monica," I said, knocking softly on the frame. She looked up from a thick binder, her focus absolute. "Megan, what's up?" I stepped inside, closing the heavy glass door behind me. The sound was a soft, definitive thump. It's about Project Wavecrest. Bitewave Labs, she said, nodding, already ahead of me. Good target, high-value IP, classic case of poor financial management, has got your name written all over it. I want you to lead the strategic assessment on this one. I took a deep breath. That's the thing, I can't. Her brow furrowed, a tiny line appearing between her eyebrows. Why not? You're the best person I have for this kind of complex analysis. The CEO, Gabrielle Walsh, I said, the name feeling strange and formal coming out of my mouth. She's my sister. Monica's eyes widened just for a second before her professional mask slipped back into place. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers and studying me. She was one of the few people who knew I had a sister in the tech world, but she didn't know the toxic details. I see, she said slowly. Okay, standard procedure. You're off the negotiation team. Completely firewalled from them. I'll give the lead to Nate Rodriguez. Thank you, I said, a wave of relief washing over me. But she added, holding up a single manicured finger, I'm not taking you off the project. I blinked. What? A conflict of interest means you can't benefit financially from insider knowledge or sit at the table with the other side. It doesn't mean your brain is off limits to us. She leaned forward, her eyes intense. Nobody knows the tech landscape in that specific sector better than you. And nobody, I suspect, knows the operational weaknesses and personal vanities of that specific CEO better than you. You won't talk to them. You won't be in the room. But you will lead the strategy from our side. You'll run the war room. You'll be Nate's ghost, his guide. You will tell him every move to make. Is that clear? A surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline shot through me. This was different. This wasn't about seeking revenge. This was about being valued for my unique, hard-won expertise. Monica wasn't asking me to use my personal connection. She was asking me to use the deep analytical knowledge that had been forged in the very shadows my family had kept me in. I looked her straight in the eye. My voice was firm, steady, crystal clear. Crystal. As I walked back to my desk, Grandpa's words echoed in my head, louder and clearer than ever before. You must stand up, not to show off, but to claim the space that has always been yours. The space had just opened up. The board was set, and this time, I was going to be one of the players. The next 6 weeks were a blur of takeout containers, late nights, and the relentless glow of computer screens. We officially set up a dedicated war room for Project Wavecrest. It wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. It was a sterile, windowless conference room on our floor, a room nobody else wanted. The air was perpetually stale, smelling faintly of dry erase markers and lukewarm coffee. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in whiteboards, which were soon layered with complex diagrams, financial models, and timelines. This was my new home. I was the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand guiding Northbridge's every move in a high-stakes corporate chess match. My team was assembled. There was Nate Rodriguez, of course. He was a solid, by-the-book negotiator, a guy who never got rattled. He'd be the public face, the one sitting across the table from my sister. Then there was my core team of analysts. Sarah, a brilliant junior lawyer from our M&A division, with an almost terrifying attention to detail. David, a quiet numbers guy who could make a balance sheet sing and confess its darkest secrets. And of course, Michael, my confidant, who I brought in to act as my second-in-command and strategic sounding board. Our first order of business was to tear apart every piece of data we could legally and ethically obtain on Bitewave Labs. This went far beyond their polished public filings and press releases. We were digging into supply chain manifests, vendor payment histories, employee reviews on Glassdoor, and social media activity of key personnel. It was a forensic autopsy of a company that was still technically alive. The picture that emerged was grim, far grimmer than even our initial Vulture report had suggested. They're not just burning cash, I told the team during one late-night session, pointing to a complex flowchart I'd drawn on the main whiteboard. The chart showed their cash flow, and it looked like a ski slope headed off a cliff. They're lighting pallets of it on fire to keep warm. Look at this. Their flagship product, the one they stake their whole reputation on, is built on a proprietary processing chip from a single supplier in Taiwan, a supplier with whom they have no long-term contract. David, the numbers guy, chimed in, his voice soft. I ran the numbers. If that supplier raises prices by even 15%, Bytewave's gross margin goes negative. If the supplier cuts them off, their entire manufacturing line grinds to a halt in less than a week. They have zero leverage. So we use that as a primary pressure point to drive the initial offer price down, Nate said, making a note on his legal pad. He was thinking about the negotiation table. Exactly, I said. But there's more. A lot more. We spent an entire afternoon listening to recordings of Gabrielle's quarterly investor calls. To the outside world, to my parents, she sounded like a genius. She used all the right buzzwords with flawless confidence: synergy, scalability, disruptive innovation, paradigm shift. She painted a vivid picture of a company on the cusp of global domination, a tech darling that was changing the world. But my team and I weren't the audience. We were the backstage crew, and we could see that the entire set was made of cardboard and held together with duct tape. Okay, listen to this clip, I said, playing a section from her Q2 earnings call. An analyst from a big Wall Street firm was asking her about their enterprise sales pipeline. Our enterprise sales cycle is incredibly robust, Gabrielle's voice echoed in the sterile conference room, dripping with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. We're in very late-stage talks with several Fortune 500 companies. The demand for our platform is frankly unprecedented. I hit pause. The silence in the room was deafening. Unprecedented, I repeated. Okay, now look at this. I pulled up a document on the main screen. It was an anonymized but verified customer relationship management report our data brokers had managed to get their hands on. It showed Bytewave's entire sales funnel for the last 6 months. Their late-stage talks consist of exactly 2 companies, I said, pointing to the screen, both of whom, as you can see here, officially passed on a pilot program more than a month ago, citing prohibitive cost and lack of dedicated support. I turned to face the team. The demand isn't unprecedented, it's practically non-existent. She's not just being optimistic, she is actively, materially misleading her investors. This is a huge red flag. Sarah, our lawyer, whistled softly. If the SEC got a whiff of this, she could be in serious trouble. The room was quiet for a moment. This was the dirty, uncomfortable part of the job. We were peeling back the layers of my sister's grand creation and finding nothing but hubris, deception, and mountains of debt at its core. Every damning piece of evidence felt like another confirmation of the lie my family and I had been living for decades. The tech prodigy was just a good storyteller, with a failing business. Michael caught my eye from across the table. He gave me a subtle, concerned look. It was a look of pity, not for Gabrielle, but for me. He knew how much this must be twisting me up inside. But then, in the midst of all the rot, we found it. Buried deep in their R&D budget, listed under a vague project code name, protected by a handful of secondary patents Gabrielle herself had likely forgotten about, was a piece of technology that was truly, breathtakingly revolutionary. It was a software algorithm for predictive image correction in low-light, high-motion environments. It was elegant, powerful, and my top engineers confirmed it was about 5 years ahead of anything else on the market. It wasn't their main product. In fact, they weren't using it at all. It was a side project, a footnote in their own internal documents. But to me, looking at the raw potential, it was like finding a flawless diamond in a dumpster. This is it, I said, my voice barely a whisper as I stared at the technical specifications. This is the real value. My God, she doesn't even know what she has. Gabrielle was trying to sell us a fancy, broken-down sports car with a cracked engine block, but she had no idea there was a priceless diamond hidden in the glove compartment. This discovery changed the entire strategic equation. My objective shifted instantly. It was no longer just about buying a failing company for pennies on the dollar to strip it for parts. It was about executing a surgical strike to rescue this one brilliant piece of tech and the small, underfunded team that had built it. Okay, new strategy, I announced to the room, my voice now firm and decisive. Everything changes. We focused the public-facing negotiation on their failing main product line. We let them think that was all we cared about. We picked it apart, showed them all the flaws we found, and made them feel like they were getting a generous deal for a sinking ship. But the real prize, the only thing that actually mattered, was this algorithm. And we needed to make sure we secured the 3-person engineering team that built it as part of the deal. They're non-negotiable, I said. They come with the deal, or the deal doesn't happen. This new focus led to the most critical discovery of the entire process. As Sarah was doing her deep dive legal due diligence, she flagged something late one night. She called me at my desk, her voice tense. "Megan, you need to see this." Immediately, I pulled up the file she sent. It was a scanned copy of an old, obscure contract from when Bitewave was just a two-person operation in a garage. Gabrielle had partnered with a university programmer on the early foundational technology. The contract was poorly written, a classic startup mistake, but one clause was terrifyingly clear. If Bitewave was ever sold or had a change of control event, the rights to any and all derivative technology developed in the first 3 years of the company's existence would automatically revert to this programmer unless he was bought out for a specific and now very substantial sum. The predictive image algorithm, the diamond, our entire reason for the deal, had been developed in year 2. It was a derivative work. And the programmer, a guy named Dr. Alastair Finch, who was now a tenured professor at Carnegie Mellon, almost certainly had no idea. If we bought the company without settling this clause, Finch could sue Northbridge and potentially win the rights to the very technology we were really after. The whole $45 million deal would become worthless overnight. It was a poison pill hidden in the company's DNA. Worse, if Gabrielle caught wind of this, she might try to use it as leverage, demanding a higher price. She might even try to cut a side deal with Finch herself, destroying the entire acquisition. "We have to fix this," I said to Sarah, my mind racing quietly. "And before we make the final binding offer, we need a lawyer who specializes in this kind of IP recovery." This was where my job became a high-wire act over a canyon. I had to orchestrate a solution without leaving any fingerprints. I spent 2 sleepless nights with Sarah and our top corporate counsel, building a complex legal and financial strategy to neutralize the Finch problem. We would structure the deal so that a portion of the $45 million acquisition funds, the exact amount stipulated in the old contract, would be placed in a separate secure escrow account. This account would be used to buy out Dr. Finch's rights after the main deal was signed and closed. It was a delicate, multi-layered maneuver that completely protected Northbridge without tipping our hand to Gabrielle or her team. I was performing corporate brain surgery in the dark, with my sister as the unwitting patient. During the final rounds of negotiation, Nate would call me from a private room at the law firm in San Francisco just before and after each session. "She's unbelievable," he'd say, his voice a mix of frustration and grudging awe. "She's acting like she's bestowing a great gift upon us. She's demanding we keep her on as a transitional consultant, with a salary that's honestly insulting." "Let her have it," I'd reply, looking at the numbers on my screen. I'd already modeled it out. "The consulting fee is a rounding error compared to what that algorithm is worth to us. Don't fight her on it. Make her feel like she won." I was building her a golden bridge to walk across, and all she could see was her own magnificent reflection in it. I was handing her a $45 million lifeline, and she was going to call it a victory lap. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. The day the deal was finalized, Monica called me into her office. "The board approved it this morning," she said, a rare wide smile on her face. $45 million. "You were right about the hidden value in that algorithm. They think you're a goddamn genius, Megan." "The team did great work," I said, deflecting out of habit. "You led the team," she countered, her gaze sharp. "This was your strategy. It was flawless from start to finish." She leaned forward, her expression turning more serious. "You know that promotion to vice president we've been talking about? I think it's time to make it official. I'm putting the paperwork through this afternoon. The salary bump will be significant." VP, Vice President. It was the title I'd been working toward my entire career. It was validation. It was success. But in that moment, it felt strangely, profoundly hollow. Who could I tell? My parents would offer a polite, "Oh, that's nice, dear," before launching into a 5-minute monologue about how proud they were of Gabrielle for the big success of her company being acquired. As if on cue, an email landed in my inbox. It was from my mom. "Hi, honey. Just a reminder that Thanksgiving is at your grandpa's this year. We're so excited to celebrate Gabrielle's wonderful news. Please try not to be late. Love, Mom." Celebrate Gabrielle's wonderful news. My news, my promotion to VP, the successful orchestration of a complex multi-million-dollar deal, wasn't even on the radar. It was invisible, just like I had always been. Michael walked by my desk and saw the look on my face. "Let me guess, the Thanksgiving invitation arrived?" "Worse," I said. "The command performance invitation." He sighed and leaned against the cubicle wall. "You know what you are, Meg? You're a ghost. You just orchestrated the biggest deal of your career, saved your sister's legacy from her own incompetence, and secured your own future, and you're about to walk into that house and pretend you just push paper for a living." He was right. But the thought of the confrontation, of the drama, of the inevitable accusations of jealousy, it was utterly exhausting. "It's just one dinner," I said, more to myself than to him. "I'll survive. What's the worst that can happen?" The week leading up to Thanksgiving felt like the eerie, unnatural calm before a hurricane. The sky's a strange color, the air is too still, and you know something terrible is about to break. The deal was signed, the press releases were out, and the tech blogs were buzzing. Most of them ran with the polished narrative Gabrielle and her PR team were spinning. And Bitewave Labs concludes a strategic partnership with Northbridge Systems in a landmark deal. Partnership, not a desperate last-minute rescue from the fiery wreckage of insolvency. My life became a bizarre study in contrast. By day, I was a respected executive, leading meetings to plan the smooth integration of Bitewave's technology and personnel into our corporate structure. I was working specifically on plans for the 3-person engineering team that built the algorithm, the team I had fought to keep intact and give new resources to. I was, in a very real sense, the architect of their future. By night, I was just Megan, dodging calls from my parents who were practically bursting with pride for their daughter. "Your sister is just so brilliant, Megan," my dad said in a message he left on my voicemail, his voice thick with emotion. "To build something from scratch and then have the business acumen to sell it for that much money. It's the American dream. We're so proud." I deleted the message without listening to the end. Couldn't bear it. Each word of praise for her felt like a tiny paper cut, insignificant on its own. But after a lifetime of them, I was starting to feel like I was bleeding out. The real gut punch, the moment that solidified the cold, hard knot of anger in my stomach, came on a Tuesday night. I was working late, doing a final review of the massive acquisition file, a kind of digital postmortem to ensure every I was dotted and every T was crossed before it was sent to long-term archiving. It was tedious work, but my brain was too wired to sleep. Deep in the most secure folder of the due diligence archive, a folder only a handful of us had access to, was the complete financial workup on Bitewave's principal officers. I clicked open Gabrielle's file, and there it was, a secured PDF from the San Francisco County Recorder's Office, a document showing that 2 months before the acquisition, Gabrielle had taken out a massive second mortgage on her beautiful home in the Pacific Heights neighborhood, a home she shared with her husband, Harrison. I stared at the document on the screen, the legal language swimming before my eyes. The amount was staggering. She had personally guaranteed the loan against the value of her house to make payroll for 1 more quarter. She had bet her family's home on a miracle, and I was that miracle. I closed the file, a wave of something cold and deeply unpleasant washing over me. It was a strange, toxic cocktail of pity and disgust. The breathtaking arrogance Gabrielle projected to the world, to our family, was a shield. A brittle piece of armor designed to hide the sheer, bone-deep terror of a gambler who had pushed all her chips into the middle of the table and was bluffing on a losing hand. I leaned back in my chair and thought of Harrison. I'd only met him a handful of times at holiday gatherings. He was kind, a pediatrician, a grounded and gentle soul who seemed completely unaware of the toxic dynamics of the Walsh family. He just saw the brilliant, confident, successful woman Gabrielle pretended to be. What would happen when he found out the truth, that the foundation of their life together had been gambled away without his knowledge? Would their marriage survive a betrayal of trust that profound? The thought of a potential divorce, of lives being torn apart because of my sister's suffocating pride, made me feel physically sick. The next evening, I was having a beer with Michael at a quiet, dark bar near our office, the kind of place you go when you don't want to be seen. The jukebox was playing old Tom Petty. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he said, stirring his drink with a plastic straw. "You've got that look." "I'm trying not to," I confessed, staring into the amber depths of my glass. "I found out she mortgaged her house, Mike, without telling Harrison. She used it to keep the company afloat for another few months." Michael whistled softly, a low, impressed sound. "Wow, that's next-level desperation. That's not just business. That's personal." He took a long sip of his beer. "You know, you're in a truly impossible spot. If you say something at Thanksgiving, you're the bitter, jealous little sister trying to steal her thunder. If you say nothing, you let her keep lying to everyone, including her own husband, who has a right to know his entire life savings were on the line." "There's no winning move," I said, the words feeling heavy and true. "It's like that scene in War Games. The only way to win is not to play the game. Maybe, Michael said, looking at me seriously over the rim of his glass. Or maybe, after 35 years of being forced to play her game by her rules, it's finally your turn to play. You're not the 8-year-old kid with the paper game anymore, Meg. You're the woman who owns the whole damn casino. You get to decide the rules now. You get to decide when the game is over. His words stuck with me, echoing in my head for the next 2 days. For so long, I had seen myself as a helpless victim of my family's narrative, powerless to change it. But Michael was right. The power dynamic had fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. I just hadn't been willing to acknowledge it or use it yet. The final push came 2 days before Thanksgiving. I was at home trying to unwind when my phone rang. It was my dad. This was rare. He was a man of texts and voicemails, not spontaneous conversation. "Megan," he said, his voice full of cheerful, oblivious energy, "your mother and I were just talking. We think it would be a wonderful gesture if you brought Gabrielle a really nice bottle of champagne, to dinner on Thursday, to celebrate her incredible success." I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning white, my throat went dry. A gesture. He wanted me to buy a victory trophy for the person who had spent a lifetime making me feel small, for a victory that was entirely, secretly, my own creation, a victory that had saved her from personal and financial ruin. I'll think about it, Dad," I managed to say, my voice tight and strained. "Don't just think about it, sweetheart," he pressed on, completely deaf to the tension in my voice. "It's the right thing to do. She's your sister. You should be proud of her. It's important for her to know that." After I hung up, I stood in the middle of my silent apartment. The city lights of Denver twinkled far below, and I felt a rage so pure and so cold it almost took my breath away. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a sudden fight. It was the deep, frozen, geological rage of 1,000 tiny injustices, 1,000 moments of being overlooked, 1,000 casual slights, all compressed over decades into one hard, heavy point in the center of my chest. He wasn't just asking me to be proud. He wasn't just asking me to be supportive. He was asking me to actively participate in my own erasure. He was asking me to walk onto that stage, smile, and applaud the star of the show, while my own script, my own life's work, was being shredded and burned backstage. That's when I knew. A quiet certainty settled over me. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because, for my own sanity, for the 8-year-old girl with the paper game who never got seen, for the woman I had become, I had to stop letting them write my story for me. The invitation to Thanksgiving was no longer a summons to a family dinner. It was an invitation to a reckoning, and I was going to be there. I just wasn't going to bring champagne. Thanksgiving Day arrived gray and overcast. The sky hung low over the city like a damp wool blanket. The weather matched my mood perfectly. Michael and I had agreed to go together, a silent show of solidarity I was deeply grateful for. He was my anchor in the storm I knew was coming. We deliberately arrived a little late, a strategic move on my part. I wanted to walk in just as Gabrielle was reaching the peak of her performance. The scene in Grandpa Edward's living room was exactly as I had pictured it, a tableau of my entire life. My aunts, uncles, and cousins were gathered around, listening with rapt attention. Their faces a mixture of admiration and envy. My parents, Richard and Margaret, stood near the crackling fireplace, their expressions glowing with a pride so intense it was almost painful to watch. And in the center of it all, a queen in her court, was Gabrielle, holding her wineglass like a scepter. "And so it's really about having the foresight to exit at the peak of your valuation," she was saying, her voice smooth and confident. "Northbridge is lucky to have our tech. Frankly, we're setting them up for the next decade of innovation. It was a brilliant move for all involved." My dad caught sight of me and Michael in the doorway. "Megan, you made it." He had the decency to look a little sheepish, probably remembering our phone call about the champagne. "Glad you could get away from work." Before I could answer, Gabrielle turned. That familiar, condescending smile instantly appeared, the one that always made me feel like I was 10 years old again. Ah, here she is now, my little sister Megan. Her eyes swept over me, taking in my suit and tie, the visible evidence of a long day at the office, and dismissing them with a single glance. She turned to the room, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, a performance for the crowd. The only one in the family who understands PowerPoint but still thinks AI is American Idol. The laughter was polite, forced, but it still felt like a slap across the face. My jaw tightened. I felt Michael put a steadying hand on my shoulder for a brief second. A silent message. Stay calm, you got this. I took a deep, centering breath. This was it, the moment of truth. I just stood there, meeting her gaze, and said nothing. My silence seemed to unnerve her more than any angry retort would have. I could see a flicker of confusion in her eyes. This wasn't in the script. I was supposed to mumble a defense or just look down at my shoes. But it was my grandpa who broke the spell, who threw the script into the fire. He had been watching the entire exchange from his worn leather armchair, his expression unreadable. He slowly, deliberately set down the history book he was reading on the small table beside him. The thud of the heavy book echoed in the suddenly quiet room. "That's an interesting take, Gabrielle," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority that commanded attention. He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. "You make it sound as if you held all the cards in this negotiation." Gabrielle laughed, a sound that was just a little too loud, a little too brittle. "Well, Grandpa, in this case, I did. It's called negotiation. You have to project strength to get what you want." Grandpa's gaze didn't waver. His eyes, the eyes of a mathematician who saw the world in proofs and logical conclusions, shifted from her to me. He pinned me with a look, and then he posed the question that would change everything. The question that wasn't a question at all, but a key offered to me to unlock the prison of my lifelong silence. "Megan," he said, and every head in the room swiveled in my direction. "You work in that world. Is it true that a company on the brink of failure can choose its buyer for a $45 million price tag?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and cheerful holiday spirit out of the room. It was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Gabrielle's confident smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then quickly hardened into annoyance. "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped, her glare shifting to Grandpa. "Bitewave was not on the brink of failure. That's ridiculous, wasn't it?" Grandpa asked softly, his eyes still on me, waiting. This was my cue. The door he had opened for me. No more hiding. No more enduring the casual cruelty. No more being the family ghost. Gabrielle turned her glare on me. Her eyes narrowed. "What is he talking about, Megan? Do you know anything about this?" Her tone was accusatory, as if I had somehow conspired with an old man to ruin her moment. "You don't know anything about my business." I took a slow breath, letting it out just as slowly, and then I spoke, my voice quiet but preternaturally clear, each word carefully chosen and aimed like a precision-guided missile. "Actually," I said, looking directly at her for the very first time, not as a little sister, not as an afterthought, but as an equal, "I know everything about your business." A confused murmur rippled through the room. My father took a half step forward, his face a mask of angry confusion. "Megan, what are you talking about? Stop being ridiculous and have some respect for your sister." I ignored him. I kept my eyes locked on Gabrielle's. "I know that Bitewave Labs was projected to be cash flow negative with a burn rate that would have put you into insolvency within 120 days. I know that your two biggest enterprise clients had already passed on renewing their contracts for the next fiscal year. I know that you had delayed payroll for your 53 employees, twice in the last quarter." With every fact I stated, a little more color drained from her face. Her mask of smug superiority was cracking, crumbling piece by agonizing piece under the weight of cold, hard truth. "I also know," I continued, my voice steady, unforgiving, "about an old partnership contract with a Dr. Alistair Finch from your Carnegie Mellon days. A contract you probably forgot you ever signed. A poorly written clause in that contract gave him the reversionary rights to all derivative works if the company was ever sold. That includes your only truly valuable asset, the predictive image algorithm, a clause that, if we hadn't found it and fixed it, would have made your company's entire patent portfolio completely worthless." Gabrielle's wineglass trembled violently in her hand. She was staring at me, her mouth slightly agape, as if seeing a stranger for the very first time. My dad looked utterly bewildered, turning from me to Gabrielle. "What is she saying, Gabby? This is nonsense, right? Tell her it's nonsense." "Is it?" I asked, finally turning my gaze to my father. "Is it nonsense?" I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a slim, unassuming file folder, the original strategic assessment I had written for Monica, the genesis of the entire deal. I walked forward, past my stunned relatives, and placed it gently on the coffee table in front of them all. It landed with a soft, definitive thud that echoed like a gavel in the dead silence. Northbridge Systems didn't just stumble upon Bitewave in a stroke of good luck, I said, my voice resonating in the still room. The company was targeted, a company with valuable, deeply mismanaged assets, and a desperate CEO was identified as a prime acquisition target. I paused, letting the full weight of my words sink in. I looked around the room, at my stunned parents, my curious aunts and uncles, and finally back at my sister, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated ash and shock. Then I delivered the final fatal blow. The person who wrote the initial report identifying the opportunity, the person who ran the strategic analysis from the war room, the person who designed the entire acquisition strategy and built the $45 million valuation from the ground up. I let the silence hang for one more beat. That person was me. If the silence before was heavy, this was a black hole, a total absence of sound, of movement, of breath. I could feel the collective shock of 20 people sucking the oxygen out of the air. My mother brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. My father stared at the folder on the table as if it were a venomous snake, his face slack-jawed. Michael, standing by the door, had a small, grimly satisfied smile on his face. He gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. And Gabrielle, she just stood there, frozen. The wine glass finally slipped from her nerveless fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor, splashing red wine like blood across the beautiful Persian rug. The sound was explosive in the quiet room. The illusion she had so carefully constructed around herself, the story she had told our family, her husband, the world, had just been utterly, ruthlessly, and publicly vaporized in under 60 seconds. The star of the show had just found out that the entire stage, the lights, the script, and the audience had been assembled by the background actor. She never even bothered to notice. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, without a word, without looking at anyone, Gabrielle turned and walked stiffly out the back door, letting the screen door slam shut behind her. The sound was like a gunshot, signaling the end of the play and the beginning of whatever came next. For a long, paralyzing moment, no one in the living room moved. They just stared at the back door Gabrielle had disappeared through. Then their eyes darted back to me, then to the shattered wine glass on the floor. Their faces were a confused, chaotic jumble of shock, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. My dad opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, looking utterly lost, like his entire world had been tilted off its axis. My mom just looked pale and sick, her hands still pressed to her mouth. I didn't wait for them to process it. I didn't want to be there for the questions, the accusations, the inevitable family drama. My target had been Gabrielle and the truth. Now that the truth was out, the fallout was secondary. I turned and followed my sister outside. The cold November air hit me like a splash of icy water to the face, shocking my system. The backyard was dark and quiet, the only light spilling from the warm glow of the kitchen window, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. I found Gabrielle standing on the edge of the stone porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold her crumbling world together. She was staring out into the blackness of the yard, where the bare branches of the aspen trees looked like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. She wasn't crying. She just looked broken, defeated, smaller than I had ever seen her in my entire life. I stood a few feet away, my hands in my pockets, not saying anything, just giving her space. The silence between us now was different. It wasn't the old silence of indifference and resentment, or the tense, explosive silence of the living room. It was a raw, uncertain, and deeply sad silence, filled with the wreckage of everything I had just blown up. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was raspy and low, not directed at me, but at the darkness itself. "You must be enjoying this. You must be having the night of your life." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, laced with a bitterness so profound it felt acidic. "No," I said, and it was the simple, honest truth. "I'm not. This wasn't about enjoyment. This was about necessity." She let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. It was a terrible, broken sound. "Right. Of course not. You just wanted to completely and totally humiliate me in front of the entire family. In front of Harrison. Well, mission accomplished, Megan. Congratulations, you finally won. You." "This wasn't about winning," I said, stepping a little closer. The cold of the stone patio seeped through the soles of my dress shoes. This was about the truth being told. For once, it had to come out, Gabrielle. She finally turned to look at me, her face pale in the dim light, her eyes glistening. The trademark arrogance was gone, completely stripped away, replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability I had never seen in her before. It was like looking at a stranger. "The truth?" she said, her voice cracked, gaining a frantic edge. "You want to talk about the truth? The truth is I was drowning, okay? I've been drowning for over a year, and I couldn't tell anyone." Her composure finally shattered. "I mortgaged the house, Megan," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Our house. Harrison doesn't know. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To wake up every single morning with this pit of ice in your stomach, so terrified you can barely breathe. To be terrified to open your email because you know there's going to be another warning from an investor, another angry message from a supplier you can't pay, another lawyer letter." She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks, catching the light from the kitchen window. "The ridiculous consulting salary I demanded, it wasn't for me. It was the exact amount I needed to pay back the loan before Harrison's parents asked about our finances. They want to set up a college fund for our future kid, a kid we've been trying to have for 2 years via IVF." She let out a shuddering breath. "It was all a house of cards, Megan, and I was just trying to keep it from falling for one more day. I just needed one more day." We stood in silence again. For the first time in my life, I wasn't listening to the golden child or the tech prodigy. I was listening to my sister. And for the first time, I think, she was telling the absolute, unvarnished truth.